This is a work of fiction. All characters, organizations, and events depicted are invented. Stonecrest Vineyard glowed under the late afternoon sun like something built to be envied. Rows of vines ran down the hillside in dark, disciplined lines, stretching toward a valley that belonged, on paper and in blood, to one family. Black cars lined the drive outside the main house. Inside the tasting room, guests in tailored suits lifted glasses to a transition nobody in that valley had dared question out loud. Clara Wren, the regional council's neutral custodian, stood near the back of the room with the guest list in hand. The same official whose signature would need to witness the transfer of the estate's charter later that evening, whether Victor remembered that detail or not. Victor Sloane was about to be named master of the estate his father had built and his grandfather had bled for. He'd rehearsed the ceremony in his head a dozen times on the drive up from the city. The toast, the handshake with the regional families, the moment his uncle would step back and let him stand alone at the head of the table for the first time. None of it had prepared him for what was actually waiting when the cars finally stopped. But the eyes in that room weren't on Victor. They were on the bees circling the family chapel. The chapel stood behind a line of cypress trees, its iron gate wrapped in a silver chain that had not moved in years. The garden behind it had been forbidden for longer than most of the staff could remember. Gideon Sloane, Victor's uncle, stood near the chapel with his jaw set, his voice pitched low and cold enough to carry. The beekeeper has let her pests disgrace your inheritance. Rosie Bell stepped out from the edge of the vineyard row, veil pushed back, hands stained with wax and old honey. Her suit was patched at the elbows, altered years ago by her father's careful stitching to fit a body he'd never once suggested she apologize for. Somewhere near the tasting room door, a staff member muttered just loud enough to be heard. The bee girl thinks her insects own the chapel now. Victor heard it. He didn't correct it. Rosie had grown up on the far edge of this same land, in a cottage that came with her father's job long before it came with anything of her own. 20 years of keeping bees for the Sloane family, buried 2 winters ago, leaving her his hives and, though nobody at the estate ever said it directly, his exact position in the household's eyes. Useful, tolerated, easy to dismiss. He only looked at Rosie and delivered the words like a verdict already written. You and your hives are off my estate by sunrise. Rosie didn't lower her eyes to him first. She looked at the bees. They weren't lunging at guests. They weren't diving at the chapel doors. They were moving in a steady, repeated line toward the forbidden garden behind it, the way bees move when they've found something worth returning to. What are they doing then? Victor asked, more challenge than question. They are not attacking your chapel, Rosie said. They are showing you where flowers are growing from soil your family moved. Something crossed Gideon's face for less than a second, gone before most people would have caught it. Victor caught it. He'd known his uncle his entire life, as a man who spoke about honor the way other men spoke about weather, constantly, comfortably, as though it were simply a condition of the world rather than a choice anyone made. Gideon had raised him after his mother's disappearance more than his own father ever managed to, had taught him which wine lots mattered and which handshakes could be trusted, and had never once in 19 years let a flicker of doubt cross that composed, patient face. Watching it happen now, over something as small as a flower, told Victor more than he wanted to admit. And for the first time on the day he was meant to inherit everything, the estate beneath his feet stopped feeling like something he owned. It felt like something getting ready to testify against him. Victor walked Rosie away from the tasting room before the moment could become a story. Guests repeated over dinner in 3 other cities, leaving word with the event coordinator to suspend the ceremony until he returned. Gideon followed, pressing a removal order into his nephew's hand before they'd even reached the apiary gate. She's her father's daughter, Gideon said, lived off Sloane land her whole life, and now she's inventing a scandal to keep her hives on it. You expect me to halt my inheritance ceremony because of bees? Victor asked Rosie, not bothering to disguise his impatience. No, Rosie said. I expect you to wait 1 hour before you destroy the only witnesses on this estate who don't know how to lie for your family. Victor didn't like the sentence. He liked less how badly his uncle wanted her gone before that hour could happen. If I'm wrong, Rosie said, I leave before sunrise. My hives, my equipment, all of it. And if you're right. She looked toward the chapel roofline, barely visible past the cypress trees. Then someone has been lying to you longer than I've been alive. Victor gave her the hour, not because he believed her, because he was the one signing removal orders now, not his uncle. and he intended that fact to mean something on his first day. Gideon had run this estate for a decade in his brother's absence and longer still in his nephew's, and Victor had spent most of his adult life assuming that arrangement would simply continue under a different name on the deed. Standing in the apiary with the smell of smoke and honey in the air, he found himself, for the first time, uncertain whether that assumption had ever actually been his own idea. Rosie walked back to the apiary and marked a small group of foraging workers as they left the hive, painting a tiny dot on each thorax before they took flight, not after they'd already reached wherever they were going. "I don't command them," she told Victor, catching the skepticism on his face. "I follow them. This isn't magic. It's a route." The marked bees rose in a loose cloud and turned, without hesitation, toward the same corner of the estate the entire colony had apparently already agreed on. Rosie and Victor followed the line the bees had cut through the air, past the wine cellar entrance, past the old stone wall separating the working vineyard from the family grounds. The walk took longer than Victor expected, long enough that the ceremony he was supposed to be standing at the center of had surely started without him by now, long enough that he found himself, oddly, not caring. Inside the hive box before they'd left, the waggle dance had pointed the same direction twice, a detail Rosie translated for Victor the way someone explains a language they've spent a lifetime learning. The marked workers returned from the chapel garden, dusted in pollen the color of pale silver, almost white. Nothing like the gold dust clinging to bees working the vineyard rows. Rosie caught one gently between two fingers, brushing a sample from its legs onto a glass slide without harming it. "You expect me to believe insects understand my family better than I do?" Victor asked. "No," Rosie said. "I expect you to believe they understand flowers better than your uncle does." Gideon tried to cut the moment short, but Rosie had already opened the estate's chapel garden planting plan on her tablet, a document Victor hadn't known existed until that afternoon. Nothing in it produced pollen that color. No silver vetch appeared anywhere in the approved design. Rosie held the slide up to a field lens, and the color resolved into something unmistakable to anyone who'd spent years around it. "Marabelle silver," she said. The name landed in the air between them like something sharp dropped on stone. Victor went still. Rosie explained, carefully now, that the cultivar had been imported years ago for a private greenhouse, a near-white strain of silver vetch that didn't grow wild anywhere in the region. Her father had recorded it in his beekeeping notebook because the pollen was rare enough to be memorable. "Silver vetch grows anywhere," Gideon said. "Not this one," Rosie answered. "This cultivar was imported for your sister-in-law's greenhouse, and this estate hasn't purchased a single seed of it since she disappeared." She turned back to Victor. "They go where the pollen is. Your family name can't change where it came from." Rosie led Victor to the old greenhouse, glass panels furred with moss, the padlock coated in rust except for a bright, recent scratch across its face. The path there ran past a row of dead rose bushes nobody had pruned in years, and a garden bench with one leg sunk into the earth, the whole approach carrying the particular stillness of a place people had agreed, without ever discussing it, to stop walking toward. Gideon insisted no one had gone inside in years. Victor looked at the lock, then at Rosie, and gave the order to open it anyway. Inside, the trays were dry, the shelving thick with dust, but one corner of the floor showed a shallow depression where soil had clearly been scooped away, recently enough that the disturbed edge hadn't softened yet. Rosie didn't try to explain that alone. She sent for Jonah Marr, the estate's longtime soil manager, a man who arrived visibly irritated at being pulled into what he assumed was the bee girl's imagination. His irritation didn't survive contact with the evidence. Rosie set a handful of chapel garden soil beside a handful from the greenhouse floor, and Jonah went quiet almost immediately, turning both samples over in his palm the way a man checks work he's afraid he already knows is his own fault. The greenhouse substrate carried charcoal grit and a lime mix nothing like the chapel beds, a different moisture level, a mineral smell the chapel garden had never needed. "Chapel garden doesn't use this soil," Jonah admitted. "Then why is it behind the chapel?" Rosie asked. Jonah had no answer for that. Victor requested the grounds cart log without waiting to be asked twice. The cart had been checked out and driven near the chapel on exactly 2 occasions in the estate's records. The night his mother disappeared, years ago, and again 3 days before the inheritance ceremony. A renovation invoice listed drainage stabilization, chapel garden, attached to no verifiable contractor, authorized by a signature Victor recognized instantly. Gideon's. Victor didn't order the ground opened. Not yet. "Seal the garden," he said. "No one touches that soil until I've seen every key log, every cart log, every invoice tied to that fund." It wasn't trust in Rosie. It was the first time in his life he'd chosen not to let his uncle decide something for him. The chapel garden gate opened for the first time in years, hinges shrieking against rust, revealing moss-covered angel statues and rows of white flowers, planted in unnaturally perfect lines. No stone anywhere bore his mother's name. Rosie followed the marked B's to a shaded corner behind the stone border, and there, tucked beneath the white blooms, a scatter of pale silver flowers had just begun to open. They stood barely taller than the grass around them, small and unremarkable to anyone who hadn't spent a lifetime learning exactly which flowers a particular colony would cross an entire estate to reach. The topsoil above them looked younger than the ground around it. The roots beneath had met a layer of earth packed down harder than anything natural explained. This ground was disturbed, Rosie said, covered, and disturbed again. Something pale caught in the root mass as she worked, a fragment of old wax, dark with age, threaded with a scrap of fabric. Not fresh wax from her own hives, old wax, the kind her father had once used to help waterproof paper for Maribel, back when the two of them still spoke about the greenhouse like it mattered. "Enough," Gideon said. "She's turning dirt into a shrine. I kept this house alive," he added, quieter, almost to himself, "while your mother tried to hand its secrets to men who would have burned it to the ground for the satisfaction of a clean conscience." Victor didn't look at his uncle. He looked at the ground, and then at the chapel key cabinet Gideon had personally guarded for as long as Victor could remember. "Bring me the chapel key log," Victor said. Gideon struck back before the log could be pulled. He produced a bag of Maribel silver seed, found, he claimed, inside Rosie's own tool shed, evidence, he said, that she'd planted the whole story herself. The room shifted immediately. Guests who had been quietly sympathetic a moment earlier now looked at Rosie the way people look at someone caught mid-lie, and Victor felt the ground he'd just started to trust her on tilt underneath him again. One of the estate guards laughed under his breath. "A woman who lives in mud and honey shouldn't speak of Sloane blood." Rosie let the words sit without flinching. Victor heard them clearly this time, though he still hadn't fully chosen a side. Rosie examined the seed bag instead of arguing with the room. It carried no propolis dust, despite supposedly sitting inside a working bee shed for months. The lot number matched estate inventory, not anything she'd ever purchased herself. The seeds inside were newer than the flowers already blooming behind the chapel. Coated in a chemical treatment the estate's own greenhouse records confirmed buying, in packaging bearing a storage mark from Gideon's own supply room. "If I wanted to fake a grave," Rosie said, "I wouldn't choose the one flower your mother planted and your uncle feared." Gideon changed targets instead of defending the seeds. He returned to the old story. Maribel had run, taken money, abandoned her son, disgraced the Sloane name. He produced a silk scarf, the same one Victor had been shown as a boy, the one piece of proof that his mother had chosen to leave him. Victor took it into his hands, and old memory rose up faster than he could stop it. Gideon ordered the excavation equipment brought around to the chapel garden. The hives were ordered moved. Victor, caught somewhere between grief and instinct, signed a temporary removal order before he'd fully decided to. Rosie was escorted out through the front gate, the bees lifting into confused, scattered flight behind her. That was where the story went dark. Outside the gate, Rosie watched the hive boxes being carried off in the distance, the colony's flight pattern breaking apart into panic. She'd moved these same boxes a dozen times over the years, always at dusk, always slow. Watching estate hands haul them out in broad daylight felt less like an eviction and more like something being deliberately broken. She spoke to Victor through the iron bars, her voice low but not shaking. "You can remove me, but the pollen is already on your land. And the seeds were found in your shed," Victor answered, flat and cold. Rosie's eyes went to the scarf still folded in his hand. She asked to see it. Gideon refused. Victor hesitated, then handed it over anyway. Rosie didn't perform grief over it. She checked the folds instead. The creases were still sharp, pressed in long before any wax could have touched the fabric. No mud clung to it anywhere. No outdoor pollen, no seed burr caught in the weave. Nothing that belonged to a woman who'd supposedly fled across open ground in the middle of the night. What it carried instead was the faint scent of cedar storage and old archival paper. "This was folded before the wax ever touched it," Rosie said. "Your mother didn't drop this running. Someone stored it so they could show it to you later." Victor looked down at the scarf in his hands. and the proof that had shaped an entire childhood of resentment revealed itself for what it actually was. Not evidence of an escape, a prop. He turned to his uncle, and when he spoke, his voice had dropped low enough that everyone in earshot leaned in without meaning to. Cancel the machines. Gideon told him grief was clouding his judgment. Victor tore the removal order in half. Open the gate. Rosie walked back through it, not because Victor had forgiven her, but because the evidence had made her impossible to dismiss. Open the ground, Victor said, with witnesses. Victor called Clara Wren, the region's neutral estate custodian, before he called anyone loyal to the Sloane name. While she was still en route, Gideon quietly sent 2 men toward the greenhouse with instructions to clear it out and burn what was left. A message intercepted by an estate guard who, for the first time in years, chose to bring it straight to Victor instead of to Gideon. The chapel garden was cordoned off within the hour, every step recorded, nothing touched without Clara's signature on it first. Rosie marked the excavation site based on what the evidence had already shown her. The pattern of Marabelle silver growth, the greenhouse soil, the wax fragment tangled in the roots, the soil probe readings, the disturbed edge of the stone border. The excavation team worked in careful layers, lifting the young topsoil section by section under Clara's direct supervision. Nobody spoke above a murmur. Even the guards who'd laughed at Rosie that morning stood with their hands folded, watching the ground the way people watch something they're no longer sure they have the right to look away from. Somewhere behind them, one of the marked bees drifted low over the freshly turned earth, unhurried, as if it had simply come to confirm what it had already known for hours. A stone slab surfaced first, flat and deliberately placed. Beneath it, old cloth and remains that had waited there far longer than anyone standing in that garden wanted to admit. The details weren't described aloud, and didn't need to be. What Victor saw, kneeling at the edge of the excavation, was a small locket, tarnished but intact. Inside it, a photograph of himself at 7 years old and a thin strip of faded blue ribbon tucked beside it. Victor didn't cry in front of his own estate, but he stopped standing like an owner. He stood like a boy who'd spent his whole life being taught to hate the woman lying in front of him. The excavation paused there, out of respect and procedure both, while Clara catalogued every personal effect in silence, refusing every offer of coffee or a chair. The kind of steady presence that made it impossible for anyone in that household to later claim the record had been shaped by family hands. Formal identification, dental and genetic, would take days to confirm through the council's own independent forensic laboratory, contracted specifically because it answered to no family on either side of the valley. Rosie's attention moved past the remains, to the wax fragment she'd pulled from the roots earlier. It didn't match anything found with the body. It pointed instead toward the stone border a few feet away, where the Marabelle silver grew thickest. She found a narrow gap between 2 stones there, sealed shut with old wax, easy to miss unless you already knew what you were looking for. The same dark, aged wax as the fragment from the root mass, and when Rosie held the 2 side by side, the torn edge of fabric caught in one matched exactly the frayed seam still pressed into the other. Marabelle hadn't buried the evidence with herself. She'd hidden it first, before anyone ever laid a hand on her. Inside the cavity was a small wax-sealed ledger and a folded note tucked separately into its own protective sleeve. The ledger held wine lot codes, chapel restoration fund transfers, shell buyer names, agricultural shipment numbers, and Gideon's own authorization signature running through pages of it. Page after page, in handwriting Marabelle had clearly tried to keep neat despite whatever fear she must have been working under. The entries built a picture of years of quiet theft dressed up as charity and restoration, donations that never reached a fund, shipments logged twice under different names, wine lots sold once on paper and twice in practice. Clara Wren cross-referenced one entry against a shipment scheduled to leave the estate that very night. The codes matched exactly. This wasn't only a record of what Gideon had done years ago, it was proof he was still doing it. The note was shorter, written in a hand Victor recognized instantly even after all these years. If Victor ever hates me, tell him I stayed. Tell him I kept the blue ribbon from his 7th birthday. I never left him willingly. Victor said nothing for a long moment. Behind him, Gideon tried to order his own men to pull Rosie down to the cellar, but Victor had already called in someone with no loyalty left to buy. Clara Wren froze the shipment on the spot. Jonah Marr handed over every soil log and cart record without being asked twice. The estate guards hesitated, then didn't move at all. Victor crossed the garden toward his uncle, carrying a kind of fury quiet enough to be more frightening than shouting. Rosie spoke before he could. Kill him here and they'll call it grief. Make him answer to the ledger and they'll have to call it truth. Victor stopped. He didn't drag his uncle into the dark to settle this the old way. He opened the chapel doors instead. In front of the estate staff, the neutral council witness, and everyone who'd spent years repeating the story of a woman who ran away, Victor set the ledger down on the stone altar. "My mother did not abandon this house," he said. "This house abandoned her." Then he turned to Gideon. "And you taught me to call it honor." Gideon was taken into neutral council custody in full view of the household, not quietly disappeared, not handled as a private family matter settled behind locked doors. He didn't struggle, and he didn't apologize either, walking out through the same chapel doors he'd kept locked for years, with the same composed, unreadable face he'd worn his whole life, as if even now he expected the story to somehow still bend in his favor. The wine roots tied to his name were frozen. The shell entities were opened for audit. The Chapel Restoration Foundation was placed under forensic review, and every member of staff connected to its finances was questioned in turn. Victor lost money that week, lost shipping routes, lost the illusion of a clean inheritance he'd walked into that morning, believing was his by right. Business partners who had raised glasses to him hours earlier began quietly rerouting their calls to lawyers instead. And two of the regional families sent formal letters distancing themselves from anything bearing the Sloane name until the audit concluded. His own staff watched him closely in those first weeks, waiting to see whether the son would run the estate the way the uncle had, or whether the morning in the chapel garden had actually changed anything at all. Victor read every one of them standing in his father's old office, and signed off on full cooperation with each without asking Clara Wren to soften a single finding on his behalf. What he gained instead mattered more than any of it. The truth about his mother, finally standing where a lie used to be. Months later, once formal identification had confirmed what everyone in that garden already knew, the chapel reopened its doors. Not finished, not polished. Restoration work was still ongoing, scaffolding still visible along one wall, but for the first time, one stone in that chapel carried a real name. The staff who had once whispered about the bee girl now nodded to her by name when she crossed the grounds each morning to check her hives. A habit that started the week Victor stopped a junior guard mid-sentence in front of the whole household and told him, flatly, that the woman's name was Rosie Bell and it would be used from that day forward. Jonah Marr had taken to leaving a spare set of garden gloves by the greenhouse door, an apology neither of them ever put into words. Maribel Sloane, mother, witness, the woman who stayed. Victor reinstated the old contract Rosie's father had signed with Maribel decades earlier. And he was careful about how he framed it. "I didn't only doubt you," he told her first, before any paperwork came out. "I let that doubt become an order that harmed what your father left you. I'm not asking you to forget that because I've changed my mind about the rest." "Then repair the harm," Rosie said, "before you ask what I think of the apology. Not a favor, not permission granted out of guilt." He stated plainly, in front of the estate's attorneys, that the agreement had never been legally voided in the first place. Only buried, the same way so much else on that land had been buried, by a man who no longer had the authority to bury anything. Rosie received a permanent land easement for her apiary, full independent control over her hives, back payment covering every year the estate had wrongfully denied her family's claim, and a formal correction to the record clearing her father's name of every accusation Gideon had once pinned to it. She read the paperwork twice before signing it, the way her father had taught her to read any contract with the Sloane name at the top, and found, for the first time in her life, nothing hidden between the lines. The estate, going forward, would have no authority to touch the apiary without her consent. "The old contract is restored," Victor told her. "No one moves your hives again. Restoring what was stolen isn't generosity," Rosie said. Victor nodded slowly. "No, it's the first debt." A single bee landed on his sleeve while they stood there, and Victor tensed on pure reflex, the old instinct to swat or step back rising fast. "Don't move," Rosie said. He didn't. He gave no order. He didn't wave it off, didn't call for anyone to handle it for him. He simply stood still and listened, for what might have been the first time in his adult life. "I'm learning," Victor said. Rosie looked at him a moment longer than she strictly needed to. It wasn't forgiveness, not fully, not yet, but it wasn't a closed door either. "I ordered you off my estate," Victor said, "while you were the only one actually listening to it. Then learn to listen, Rosie answered, before the land has to shout. The bee lifted off his sleeve and drifted toward the pale silver flowers blooming beside the chapel wall, unhurried, exactly where it had meant to go all along. The land had never been silent. His family had only taught him which voices to ignore.